Rain came down like nails that night, hammering the moors above the small village of Hartwell Combe. A horse screamed somewhere in the dark, and a young woman named Margaret Wren stood frozen at her cottage window, her candle flickering against the glass. She had lived alone since her father passed, tending sheep and mending nets for the fishermen who came through on market days. She knew every sound the storm could make. This one was different. A man's voice cut through the wind, ragged and desperate, calling for help. Margaret grabbed her shawl and threw open the door before she could think twice. The wind nearly took her breath. Rain soaked through her dress in seconds. She pushed forward toward the sound, her bare feet slipping on wet stone. There, at the edge of the lane, a horse lay on its side, legs kicking weakly in the mud. Beside it, a man struggled to rise, blood running down the side of his face, mixing with the rain. His coat was fine wool, torn at the shoulder. His boots were the kind she had only seen on gentlemen passing through on their way to the coast. But none of that mattered now. He was shaking, his lips pale, his eyes struggling to focus on her. "Please," he managed, reaching a hand toward her. "My horse." Margaret knelt beside him, ignoring the mud soaking through her knees. "Never mind the horse," she said. "Can you stand?" He tried. His leg buckled beneath him, and he gasped. Gripping her arm so hard, she felt the bruise forming already. She got him up somehow, his weight heavy against her small frame, and half dragged, half carried him toward her cottage, the storm screaming behind them the whole way. Inside, she laid him by the fire and stripped his soaked coat from his shoulders. Underneath, a gash ran along his ribs, deep enough to make her stomach turn. She worked quickly, the way her mother had taught her before the fever took her. Clean cloth, boiled water, pressure until the bleeding slowed. The man watched her hands the whole time, his breathing shallow, his eyes never leaving her face. "What's your name?" he whispered. "Margaret," she said, not looking up. "And you should save your strength instead of asking questions." A faint sound escaped him, something close to a laugh, quickly swallowed by pain. "Edmund," he said. "Edmund Hale." She nodded once, tying off the bandage, and said nothing more. Names did not matter to fevers and blood loss. Only time did. He drifted in and out through the night, sometimes murmuring words she could not understand, sometimes going still enough that she leaned close just to feel his breath against her palm. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside washed clean and silent. Edmund woke slowly, blinking at the low beams of her ceiling, at the small fire still crackling, at the woman asleep in the chair beside him, her hand still resting near his arm, as though she had refused to let go, even in sleep. He studied her face for a long moment. Plain dress, calloused hands, a kindness in her that he had not found in any drawing room he had ever stood in. He did not know yet that she was the daughter of a sheep farmer. He did not know her surname, or her age, or where she had learned to stitch a wound so steady it barely scarred. He only knew that she had run into a storm for a stranger, without a moment's hesitation. When she woke and found him watching her, she pulled her hand back quickly, as though caught doing something she should not have. "You're awake," she said. "Good. I feared the fever might take you." "You saved my life," he said quietly. "I did what anyone would do." "No," he said, and something in his voice made her still. "You did not." She busied herself with the fire, instead of answering, and he let her, though his eyes stayed on her back the whole time. He stayed 3 days, though he could have left after one. His leg healed faster than he claimed it did. He simply did not want to go. They spoke little of grand things. He asked about her sheep, her father, the village well that ran dry every August. She asked nothing about him at all, and he found himself wanting to tell her everything anyway. On the 3rd evening, a rider came up the lane, dressed in fine livery, calling for "Your Grace," with such urgency that Margaret's hands stilled over the pot she was stirring. She turned slowly to look at Edmund. He did not meet her eyes at first. "Your Grace," she repeated, the words hollow in her mouth. He rose, wincing only slightly now, and for the first time since she had dragged him from the mud, he looked like a stranger again. Tall, composed, a man used to rooms bowing when he entered them. "I should have told you," he said. "Should have," she agreed, setting down the spoon with more care than the moment required. "Margaret, you are needed elsewhere, Your Grace," she said, and the title came out sharper than she intended. He stepped closer, and for a moment it seemed he might reach for her hand, the way he had that first night in the storm. Instead, the servant at the door called again, more insistent this time, and whatever words Edmund meant to say dissolved before they reached her. He left with a final glance over his shoulder, one she chose not to watch for long. Margaret stood in her doorway long after the horses disappeared down the lane, the mud already drying where his coat had once lain by her fire. She told herself it did not matter. Dukes did not return to farmhouses. Dukes did not remember shepherd girls once the wounds healed and the roads were clear again. She went back to her sheep, her nets, her quiet days, and told no one in Hartwell Combe who the stranger in her cottage had truly been. Weeks passed, then months. She did not expect a letter. She did not expect a rider at her gate, or a carriage on the lane, or anything at all beyond the ordinary turning of seasons. And so when the years slipped by without word, she convinced herself she had been nothing more than a passing kindness in a man's long and forgettable life. She was wrong. Far away, in the halls of Stowcroft, a man stood before a fire, much larger than hers had ever been, staring at a torn piece of wool coat he had kept hidden in a drawer for longer than he cared to admit. He had searched 3 counties already, quietly, without his household knowing the true reason behind his sudden interest in remote farming villages. He had not forgotten her name. He had not forgotten her hands, steady over his wound while the storm raged outside. And on this particular evening, a servant entered, with news that made him set down his glass at once. A village near the coast, a woman matching her description, last seen only days ago. The Duke of Stowcroft reached for his coat before the servant had even finished speaking. The Duke's carriage tore down muddy roads faster than any coachman thought wise, wheels catching ruts hard enough to rattle teeth. Edmund Hale did not care. 3 years of quiet searching had led to nothing but false leads and disappointment, letters returned unanswered, villages visited, only to find no woman named Margaret who matched the picture burned into his memory. Now a name had surfaced again, whispered by a merchant who mentioned a healer woman near the coast, steady hands, quiet manner, kept to herself. He gripped the window frame as the carriage swayed, his knuckles pale. He told himself not to hope. Hope had betrayed him too many times already, but his heart refused to listen. Meanwhile, in Hartwell Combe, Margaret knelt in her garden, pulling weeds from around a stubborn row of turnips. Her hands had grown rougher over the years, her face touched by more sun and more worry than a woman her age should carry. She had built a small life for herself. Quiet, predictable, safe from the kind of hope that could break a person clean in half. She had stopped waiting for carriages long ago, or so she told herself. A boy came running down the lane, breathless, his cap nearly falling from his head. "Margaret! Margaret! There's riders coming! Fine ones! Horses like I never seen." Her hands stilled over the soil. For one long moment, something old and foolish stirred in her chest, something she thought she had buried 3 winters ago. She pushed it down hard. "Probably lost travelers," she said, though her voice did not sound as steady as she wanted it to. "Go on now, mind your chores." But the boy did not leave. He stood at the gate, eyes wide, staring past her shoulder. Margaret turned. The carriage came into view at the top of the lane, black and gold, the kind that never passed through a village like this one, unless something important demanded it. Her breath caught. She told herself it meant nothing. Fine carriages passed through on their way to the coast sometimes. It did not mean anything at all, but her hands were shaking as she wiped them on her apron. The carriage stopped at the edge of her garden. The door opened before the footman could reach it. Edmund stepped down first, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, his eyes already searching before his feet had fully found the ground. When he saw her, he went still. 3 years had changed him little. Broader shoulders now, a faint scar near his temple she did not remember, his hair longer than before. But his eyes were the same, exactly the same. Margaret's turnips lay forgotten in the dirt. Neither of them spoke. The wind moved gently between them, rustling the hem of her dress, carrying the smell of turned soil and distant sea air. "You're alive," Edmund said finally, his voice rough, as though the words had waited too long behind his teeth. "Why wouldn't I be?" she asked, though her heart pounded loud enough that she wondered if he could hear it from where he stood. "I searched for you," he said, "for 3 years." Margaret's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe it more than she had wanted anything in a very long time. But belief had cost her before. "You left," she said quietly, without so much as a proper word. "I had no choice that night. You had a choice every day after," she said, and this time her voice cracked slightly, betraying her. Edmund crossed the small distance between them, stopping only when he was close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I wrote letters," he said. "Dozens of them. None of them felt right. None of them said what needed saying. So I came instead, as soon as I heard your name again." Margaret studied his face, searching for the lie she was certain must be hiding somewhere in it. She found none. Still, 3 years of quiet grief did not disappear, simply because a carriage arrived at her gate. "You are a duke," she said. "I raise sheep and mend nets. Nothing has changed since the night you left, Edmund. Nothing, except the years I spent convincing myself you would never come back." His jaw tightened. "I know what I am," he said. "I know what you are not. None of that mattered to me the night you pulled me from that mud, and none of it matters to me now." The boy who had run to warn her still lingered by the gate, wide-eyed, clearly listening to every word. Margaret shot him a look sharp enough to send him scurrying off toward the village center, no doubt to spread the news faster than any carriage could travel. She turned back to Edmund, her arms crossing over her chest as though she could hold herself together by force alone. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "I want to know why you never wrote," he said. "I left my name. I left enough for anyone with the will to find me." Margaret's throat tightened. "I did write," she said quietly. "Once." Edmund's expression shifted, confusion breaking through his composure for the first time. "I received nothing. I sent it through a merchant, heading toward the capital," she said. "He promised it would reach Stowcroft's estate." Silence stretched between them, heavier now, filled with the sudden understanding that something else had happened, something neither of them yet understood. "What did it say?" Edmund asked, his voice lower now, careful. Margaret hesitated, memory pulling her back to a cold winter evening, ink smudged by her own trembling hand. "It said I hoped you were well," she said. "It said I would understand if you never came back, but that I would not forgive myself if I never told you the truth of what I felt that night by the fire." Edmund's hand rose slightly, as though he meant to touch her face, then stopped himself. "That letter never reached me," he said. "If it had." He stopped himself again, jaw working silently for a moment. "If it had reached you," Margaret finished for him. "What then?" Before he could answer, the sound of hooves thundered up the lane again. Faster this time, urgent. Both of them turned. A second rider approached, dressed not in fine livery, but in the rough travel clothes of someone who had ridden hard and long. He pulled his horse to a stop and swung down before it had fully stilled, breathing heavy. "Your Grace," the man said, bowing quickly toward Edmund, though his eyes darted nervously toward Margaret. "Forgive the intrusion. There is a matter that cannot wait." Edmund's brow furrowed. What matter could not wait 1 hour? The rider hesitated, glancing again at Margaret, before lowering his voice. "It concerns the letter, Your Grace, the one meant for you 3 years past." Margaret's stomach dropped. Edmund went very still. "Explain," he said, his voice suddenly sharp enough to cut through the quiet garden air. The rider swallowed hard. "It was intercepted," he said, "by your steward. He believed it improper for a woman of her station to correspond with you, Your Grace. He confessed only recently, on his deathbed, fearing what would become of his soul if he did not." Margaret's hand pressed against her mouth. 3 years. 3 years of silence that had never needed to exist at all. Edmund's face darkened with something Margaret had never seen in him before, something cold and dangerous beneath the composed exterior of a duke. "Where is this letter now?" he demanded. "Destroyed, Your Grace," the rider said. He admitted as much before he passed. The silence that followed felt different from before, heavier, sharper at the edges. Margaret stared at the ground, her mind spinning through 3 years of quiet mourning that had been built on nothing but a stolen piece of paper and a man's misguided sense of propriety. "Margaret," Edmund said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy, but refusing to spill over. "I am not the same girl who wrote that letter," she said. 3 years changes a person, Edmund. It changes what they believe they deserve." "And what do you believe you deserve now?" he asked, stepping closer, despite the rider still standing awkwardly nearby. Margaret opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, a sound rose from the village center, faint at first, then growing louder. Voices, many voices. Word had spread exactly as fast as she feared it would. A crowd was gathering at the edge of the lane, villagers drawn by whispers of a duke standing in Margaret Wren's garden, curiosity thick enough to taste. Edmund did not seem to notice them at all. His eyes remained fixed on her. "Tell me what you believe you deserve," he said again, quieter this time, meant only for her. Margaret's chest rose and fell unevenly. Somewhere behind them, the crowd grew louder still, and among the murmurs, a single voice called out something that made Margaret's blood run cold. "That's her! That's the woman who nursed the stranger years back. But look, there's another rider coming down from the ridge, and he's wearing Hartwell colors, not Stowcroft's." Margaret turned sharply, her heart lurching at the mention of colors, belonging to a house she had hoped never to hear of again. Edmund followed her gaze, his own expression hardening the moment he understood. "Who," he asked slowly, "is riding under Hartwell colors?" Margaret's mouth went dry, because she knew exactly who it was, and she knew his arrival changed everything she had just begun to hope for. The rider from Hartwell colors slowed his horse at the edge of the crowd, and Margaret felt every eye in the village turn toward her at once. She knew him before he even lifted his head. Thomas Bellamy, the younger son of the estate that bordered her father's old land, a man who had asked for her hand twice before and been refused twice before, each time with less patience than the last. He dismounted slowly, brushing dust from his coat, his eyes moving from Margaret to Edmund and back again, calculating something behind a thin smile. "Margaret," he said, his voice smooth in the way that had always made her skin prickle. "I heard talk in the village of a fine carriage on your lane. I came to see for myself." "Thomas," she said carefully, "this is not the time." "Is it not?" He glanced at Edmund, taking in the fine coat, the crest on the carriage door, the way the crowd had gone quiet around them. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not expect to find nobility standing in a sheep farmer's garden." Edmund's eyes narrowed slightly, though his voice remained level. "And you are?" "Thomas Bellamy. My family holds the land just beyond the ridge." He stepped closer to Margaret, close enough that she stiffened. Margaret and I have an understanding, Your Grace. Have had for some time. Margaret's jaw tightened. We have no such thing, Thomas, and you know it well. His smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes did. Her father owed my family a debt before he passed, a debt she has yet to settle. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margaret felt heat rise up her neck, not from shame, but from the old, familiar frustration of a threat she had lived under for years and never spoken of aloud. Edmund's expression shifted, cold now in a way Margaret had not seen since the writer first mentioned the stolen letter. What debt, Edmund said, requires collection through a woman's hand, rather than a lawyer's ledger? Thomas's smile faltered for the first time. This is a village matter, Your Grace. No concern of yours. She pulled a duke from a storm 3 years ago, and asked nothing in return, Edmund said, his voice carrying easily over the hushed crowd. That makes her very much my concern. The words settled over the gathered villagers like something solid, something they would repeat at market for weeks to come. Margaret felt her chest rise and fall unevenly, caught between the past pressing in from one side, and something new and trembling pressing in from the other. Thomas straightened, some of his earlier confidence draining from his face. Your Grace, I only meant— Name the sum, Edmund said flatly. Thomas hesitated. 15 pounds. Her father borrowed it the winter before he died. Send the ledger to Stowcroft by week's end, Edmund said. It will be settled in full, and you will not speak to Margaret Wren of debts again. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mixture of shock and delight rippling through them. Thomas opened his mouth as though to argue, looked once more at the crest on the carriage, and thought better of it. He mounted his horse without another word, riding back up the lane the way he had come, though not without one final glance over his shoulder at Margaret, a look she chose to ignore entirely. Silence settled over the garden, once Thomas disappeared from view, though the crowd still lingered at a respectful distance, no one willing to miss what might happen next. Margaret turned to Edmund, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron. You did not need to do that. I wanted to, he said simply. 3 years too late, but I wanted to. She looked down at the turnips, still scattered across the dirt, where she had dropped them earlier, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. You asked me what I believe I deserve, she said finally, lifting her eyes back to his. I have thought of little else the past few years, though I told myself I had stopped. And what is your answer? I deserve the truth, she said. All of it. Not letters lost to stewards, not silence dressed up as duty. If you mean to stand in my garden and speak of debts settled and storms remembered, then I want the whole truth from you, Edmund. No more half of it. Edmund reached into his coat and drew out a small, worn piece of folded wool, the very scrap torn from his coat the night she had first found him bleeding in the mud. He held it out to her. I have carried this for 3 years, he said. Through every village I searched, every false lead that led nowhere. I kept it, because it was the only proof I had that the night in your cottage was real, and not something my mind invented out of loneliness. Margaret took it slowly, her fingers brushing his as she did. The wool had gone soft with handling, the edges frayed from being folded and unfolded, more times than either of them could count. I do not want a duke's pity, she said quietly. I have lived without it for 3 years, and managed well enough. I am not offering pity, Edmund said. I am offering everything I have, Margaret. My name, my house, my time, for as long as you will have it. I searched 3 counties, not out of duty, but because I could not picture a single morning that did not include the possibility of finding you again. The crowd had gone almost entirely silent now, straining to catch every word. Margaret's eyes filled, despite her best effort to stop them. And if I say no, then I will settle the debt, return to Stowcroft, and you will never see Thomas Bellamy troubled by anything of mine again, Edmund said. I will not force a life on you that you do not want, no matter how badly I want it for myself. Margaret looked down at the scrap of wool in her hand, then up at the man standing before her. Rain-worn coat replaced now with fine tailoring, but the same steady eyes she remembered from that first storm-soaked night. "I wrote that letter because I was afraid you would forget me the moment the roads cleared," she said. "I have spent 3 years proving myself right, only to find I was wrong the entire time." "You were never wrong to hope," Edmund said, "only unlucky in the man who stood between us." A small, unsteady laugh escaped her, the first in longer than she could remember. "You still speak like a man who has practiced his words in a carriage mirror." "I practiced them for 3 years," Edmund admitted, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "I am relieved to finally use them." Margaret closed the distance between them herself this time, her hand finding his without hesitation, the scrap of old wool still pressed between their palms. "Ask me properly then," she said, "since you have clearly rehearsed it so long." Edmund's breath caught, and for a moment the composed Duke disappeared entirely, replaced by the same desperate, grateful man she had dragged from the mud years before. "Margaret Wren," he said, "will you come to Stowcroft? Not as a guest, not as a debt repaid, but as my wife." The crowd erupted before she could even answer. A ripple of gasps and delighted murmurs, spreading down the lane faster than any rider could carry news. Margaret barely heard them, her eyes fixed only on Edmund's face, on the same steady hope she remembered from a rain-soaked cottage floor. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly around the word. "Yes, Edmund." He pulled her into him without waiting for anything more, the crowds cheering, rising around them like the storm that had first brought them together, though this time there was no fear in the sound, only celebration. Above them, the clouds that had gathered earlier in the afternoon broke apart just enough to let a single shaft of late sun fall across the garden, catching the scrap of wool still clutched between their joined hands. The boy who had first run to warn her stood at the gate again, grinning wide enough to split his face, already turning to run back toward the village center, with news far better than any storm. Behind them, Edmund's carriage waited on the lane, doors open, ready to carry them both toward a life neither of them had believed they would ever have back. Margaret looked once more at her small cottage, at the garden she had tended alone for 3 long years, and then back at Edmund, who had never once looked away from her since the moment he stepped down from that carriage. She took his hand and walked toward the waiting carriage, the crowd parting for them, sunlight spilling gold across the muddy lane. If you want to see what happens next in their story, make sure you subscribe, so you never miss what comes after.